Hello, everyone. My name is Nick Harper, and I'm the Civic Engagement Director for the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. I've been asked to give a video series on redistricting principles to explain how we do redistricting, specifically in Minnesota. Let's get started. A little bit about the League. We're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. Redistricting is the focus of our people-powered Fair Maps program, and we're working in collaboration with other members of the Minnesota Alliance for Democracy and the Our Maps Minnesota campaign. This is the first video and introduction to a video series explaining different redistricting principles. But this introduction, let's just start with a couple of simple things like, what are redistricting principles? Redistricting principles are the criteria or standards we use to judge how fair or good a map is. And throughout this video series, I may interchange the words principles and criteria, but they mean the same thing in this context. So redistricting principles can be used to prevent gerrymandering and to maximize accurate voter representation. It's important to note that different states use different criteria in different ways. Each state is slightly different. It's also important to note that in Minnesota, some principles are required by federal law or state law, but most of the principles we use in Minnesota are done out of tradition and common practice. They're not necessarily required by federal or state constitution or statute. The other thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about these principles is that they do interact with each other. You and another person can have the same principles and the same geography that you're trying to create districts out of. And if you prioritize those principles differently, for example, if you rank one more highly or you consider another one more important than another one, you will likely end up with different maps. And throughout this series, I'll actually note when principles are required by law, and I'll also note when these principles do interact with a couple of examples and show visually how the interaction can change the map. So in order to explain these principles, I welcome you to Hexland. Hexland is where everything's a hex of a lot simpler. Redistricting can get very complicated and overwhelming when you're looking at in a real map in real cities and a real geography, even for folks like me who are very familiar with the redistricting principles. So in order to keep it simple and in a more digestible amount, I've created Hexland in order to help explain the different redistricting principles. This is Hexland. Hexland is, of course, made up of hexagons. In the real world, a census block group is the geographic unit used by the census. The census then measures the number of people and the demographics of those people in a block group. So we just did the census in 2020, and that data is now being calculated by the Census Bureau, and we'll receive that data hopefully later this year. In the real world, a census block group can be any shape. It can be huge, it can be small, it can be a perfect square, it can be a very weird jagged shape. In Hexland, the census block groups are always hexagons and they're always the same size. So that's nice. It's also important to note that Hexland uses census block groups as the building blocks to create its political districts. So in the real world, a political district might be based off of a census block group boundary, but it also might be based off of something smaller like a precinct or a smaller geographic unit. In Hexland, we're going to keep it simple. Everything is going to be based off of census block. The boundaries are going to be entirely based off of the census block groups so that we only have to look at the hexagons. So that's a quick introduction to Hexland. I wanted to keep things simple and clean so people can help really understand and digest some of this information. So if you're interested in learning about these principles, I recommend you start with population equality, which is the next video in this series.